and we have got a panel of experts who are going to come in and join Patricia at this point to talk about the changing European perspective. Oh, that's me changing that there. I don't want to do that. I want to change this one. Joining us on stage, we have Kevin Hanrahan, the head of Teagasc's Rural Economic Development Programme, Dr. Karen Lynch-Shalley, who is the Assistant Professor of Law at Maynooth University, and Maria Dunn is the Assistant Sec-Gen at the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. Up you come, ladies and gentlemen. Patricia, I want to begin, first of all, with you and bring it back down to the most basic of commodities. The fishers, the farmers, the small businesses. The one thing they need is certainty, the one thing they need is coherence, and the one thing they need to know is what policies are there and what it means for them. How close are we to having that cohesion that is required?
Thanks. It's a very fair question, Jonathan. Look, I know what I've just given an overview of can seem very technical and bureaucratic and legalistic and so on, and it's all a little bit abstract. But stepping back a little bit, I would say that it really is all pulling in the same direction. So the vision that Commissioner Hansen outlined in February is a kind of a roadmap really for what he plans to do over the next few years. It promises a review, as we said, of an overview of the national regulations, first and foremost, to understand what's going on in the member states, and then the revision of these directives. And that has a real impact on a farmer. If a farmer knows that he's getting a fair deal when he's going to talk with either his co-op that's then in negotiation with some of the big buyers, or indeed an SME directly dealing with one of the big players, if they know what the going rate is and how much the various different players in the system are getting out of it, they know whether they're being done or whether they're getting a fair deal, and they're in a much more strong position to bargain and negotiate. So while what looks like a very abstract lot of legalistic stuff at European level really does have an impact on the ground, it puts farmers in a better place, it puts the co-ops in a better place as well, and the producer organisations. So that transparency bit, I think, is the key really, and it's there in the vision for agriculture. It's there in the reports on the strategic dialogue. It's the thread that runs through everything that we're doing at the moment.
One of the benefits, Karen, of EU membership is that there's a level playing field. We know exactly what we're dealing with, as we do with all the other countries right around. But what is the legal significance of the EU requirements about transparency and fairness? Because when you bring a legal context, it obviously makes it a bit more serious.
Yeah, well, I suppose what I would say is a starting point, if we're thinking of it from a legal perspective, in a commercial transaction situation as we have here in the agri-food sector, our starting point is a contract law lens, and we talk about party autonomy. So the law stands outside the content of the agreement. We don't seek to determine what the obligations are. We're assuming that's an issue of bargaining between the parties. The nature of the framework at EU within the UTP, the Unfair Trading Practices, is that it moves away from that position because it identifies, it recognises and responds to the economic reality that people aren't in an equal position. So we've heard it articulated in terms of the vulnerability of farmers and primary producers. But effectively what we're saying, there is a power imbalance. There is an inequality here, and what we can see as a result of that is a transfer of economic risk and cost to those who are more vulnerable to that.
The bottom of the food chain.
Precisely, and where we have objectives of improving the financial and economic resilience of these businesses. So from that point of view, the intervention through, Patricia identified the grey and the blacklist, which correspond to the conditional and unconditional unfair trading practices, provides a scope of what is and is not permissible by identifying practices that objectively are problematic, either because they're imposed by one party unilaterally or because there's an inappropriate or imbalanced transfer of risk involved in it. So it's significant in terms of regulating what can happen legitimately within it. The other thing I think that's important about the EU framework is the scope of application. Because, and we'll acknowledge that the directive has parameters that can be varied in the member states, but you're talking about a trigger point for buyers of a 2 million turnover threshold, and no upper limit. And in the Irish context, that's where we've stopped with it, so we don't kind of put a cap on suppliers, which is at a EU level. So you're getting both the direct kind of relationship, but you're getting the cascading effect that can occur from further up in the intermediation between producers and buyers. So that's important that we're capturing so many relationships there. And the final, I suppose, relevant point is the application, because although the supplier, the vast majority, was within a domestic context, this is application not just in a cross-border context, but in respect of third countries. So if the buyer or supplier is EU established, they can be transacting with somebody outside the EU, and the relationship is still subject to this framework.
Yep, we're a good bit away from carrots in the ground on that conversation, but yeah. Ursula von der Leyen said no farmer should be forced to sell products below cost, Patricia. And I mean, to have to say it out loud is kind of alarming, but she has a point, doesn't she?
She does. She does. And the vision says that no farmer should be required to systematically sell below cost. I'm paraphrasing, but the word systematically comes in there as well. And I think it's an important point. I'm inclined to leave it to Kevin, who's the expert and the economist on the panel, to talk about what below cost actually means. But I would just say on that point that it's not the same for every country, for every member state, or indeed for one farmer next door to another. What cost is not always the same thing. The systematically issue is an important qualification, because there can be times when it's in the farmer's interest to sell below cost. So we don't want to tie their hands so tightly that they can't have the autonomy to decide, to make a decision. If there's a glut of product, if they have a bumper crop and there's a risk that a product would otherwise go to waste, farmers should be allowed, if they wish, to sell below cost, whatever cost is. But the bottom line is that it's an exception, that what the EU is driving for is that farmers are fairly compensated for their products.
There was a lovely book passed to you there, Kevin, which I'll let you pick up on. What's your take on this? I mean, it's an obvious concept, but it's not straightforward, because there's rain due at the weekend now, so farmers are going, that'll be great, that'll help the crops in the ground, and fingers crossed we'll have a good summer, but not a great summer, and they'll have a great harvest. There's so much can change over the course of a few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I work for Teagasc, and we run the National Farm Survey, so we've been doing that for 40 years. On an annual basis, we report on costs of production of farms. Not all farms, so we're missing the horticulture discussion this morning. We don't have a representative sample of horticulture farmers. And what you quickly learn as an economist who works with microdata is that there is not a cost of production. There is a distribution of costs of production. So, and that's in Ireland for any given sector. And then you think about that in a European context. I struggle with the idea that we can establish what is a fair cost. I'd be really interested to find out, as we move into the next CAP cycle, what systematically comes to mean. But I think, farmers, if they can make a profit from something, they will do it. The reality from the principal core enterprises in Irish agriculture, of your dairy farms, your beef farms, your sheep farms, your tillage farms, is that many farmers are currently, and for quite a while, have been selling products below their cost of production.
But that means that we're in a cycle, and it's a cycle that's not benefiting the farmers.
It's not a cycle. It's been like that for a long time, and farmers are paid subsidies to allow them to continue to exist in that reality.
So it's become structural.
It's in some sense by construction, but what we want to do is we want to, insofar as we can, remunerate farmers for what they're doing, for producing food and for producing other things. The challenge we have is that we haven't figured out a way to do it through the market, and that's why we have direct payments supporting farmer incomes and critical support for farm incomes in Ireland.
And I suppose, Maria, in that way, it's very hard to create policy where there is a lot of uncertainty, and government has quite the challenge on its hand there.
Yes, so I suppose the first thing you have to realise is what we're talking about here is below cost of production, not below cost selling. So there's a difference there.
Yeah.
Previously, we did have regulations around below-cost selling in Ireland back in the 80s, and my understanding is, or the reports on them showed that they didn't achieve their function and caused a lot of unintended
The
consequences.
quality of the products actually went down dramatically, if memory serves.
So I think what we have to look at here, it's positive. I think it's always better for these things to be EU-wide. We have to look at a lot of things we need to mitigate against. Kevin made a really valid point there in terms of the baseline cost of production. Cost of the production looks different even within the same sector, so we need to look at that. And also, we're very export orientated. We need to look at the impact on our export markets, and we need really to prevent even import substitution on the domestic market. So there's a complexity there. I mean, we do things through a kind of a food systems approach, so we look at all the various elements when we're making policy, and we'd have to consider all of that impact along the supply chain.
Weather is one imponderable. Another imponderable is inflation. And I regularly make the joke that there were young economists until relatively recently who had never seen inflation in the wild and were surprised when it started ravaging everything in the last couple of years. From the survey, the overriding issue for respondent suppliers in the year ahead were costs, increases and inflation at 70%. Now, inflation takes no prisoners. It's impacting the person who is growing, it's impacting the supplier, it's impacting the retailer, it's impacting consumer at the end. How in the name of all that is good and holy, Kevin, do we manage to factor inflation into policy?
Well, listen, I think there was high inflation in 22 and 2023 in general inflation and in food inflation in Ireland. Largely due to factors outside of the food system. The war in Ukraine, obviously, it was a big driver. It pushed up some feed costs and fertilizer costs, and that were reflected through the supply chain. Energy costs went up. But when I look at the data since for the last 20 or 30 years, and I divide food inflation by general inflation, the trend is downwards with a slight plateauing in the last 24 to 36 months.
A lot of people are going to be very surprised to hear that.
Go to the CSO data set and look at it yourselves. I just double checked it last night. And what that says to me is that from the perspective of the consumers, the European food system is delivering affordable food. But a lot of the concerns we have today in terms of the agri-food regulators' objectives are to look at the functioning of the food supply chain with particular concern for farmers, fishers, and small food producers. So, we have had inflation in food prices at the retail level. In fact, it's running behind inflation at farm gate level.
Would you come to the supermarket with me tomorrow? Because I'm at a loss, but you're dealing with numbers here and not making it up. Karen, I know you want to come in there.
Yeah, and it's not a legal point, but it just it occurs to me that what we have here is relative balancing of objectives here. I mean, everybody in the room is a consumer, okay, so everybody knows the impact of it on the tills. But I do think it's really important that we contextualize price with respect to the cost of that in terms of the food chain. Okay, so the price at the tills, what we're paying, what cost is it wreaking? So, I mean, if you have inflation, you have additional costs. Where are they being absorbed? I mean, obviously something like the observatory will help in substantiating perhaps distribution of that. Where are they being absorbed? Are they being absorbed by those who are most vulnerable? And if they are, at what cost? So either you're weakening the financial viability of these businesses, or if they're absorbing them, then it's having collateral effects on other aspects like the quality of food or supporting other objectives, environmental sustainability. So I think there's a really an important public awareness and dialogue part, in terms of that aspect of it and the distinction between price of food and the cost of the food chain.
Patricia, the obvious thing is inflation will always garner headlines. Doing the right thing on the farm, less so.
Yeah, and I think that's a bigger discussion that we need to have. I mean, it's likely outside the scope of this morning's topic, but I mean, Kevin is right. If you look objectively at the evidence, food is no more expensive, pound for pound, euro for euro, than it was when we joined the EU. In fact, some things are cheaper. Now, I know that's notwithstanding the fact that things did take a bit of a wobble a couple of years ago. But Karen's point about the distribution of the money and along the food chain is an important one. But we also need to have a very serious conversation about what we value, you know, as consumers. And we are all consumers. Every farmer is a consumer. They also go to the supermarket. You know, do we want to invest in sustainability? Do we want to put our money where our mouth is? You know, I could buy a chicken 20 years ago for £5. I can still buy a chicken now for £5, which is just obscene to me. Do we care about animal welfare? If so, are we prepared to pay for it? Can we pay for it? Can the consumer pay for it? Or are other costs where inflation is having more of an impact around heating your household, for example, is that eating into your disposable income for food? So I think we need to have a grown-up conversation around this, and I think it's something that will have to be thrashed out in the course of how we value the input of farmers. Again, Kevin referred to the income of farmers, and we talk about the sustainability of an income for farmers. The reality is that an awful lot of farmers are in business because they're being cushioned, and rightly so. It's a European policy that we underpin the earnings of farmers to make sure that we have a functional, sustainable food system. Big conversations to be had about that over the next couple of years.
And how do we balance that, Kevin? Because it's a real question of balance, isn't it? Because it's not like the industry is standing still, because the retailers are on an ESG journey, the farmers are on an ESG journey, and we can't just keep talking as if it's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is that the European consumers and the political system says these are all the things that are really important and we need to change. The big retailers and the food service companies are telling the world about their ESG commitments and how they're going to change things. But of course, what that often means is they demand that their suppliers change things. Yeah. So the costs of the adjustment get pushed towards the basic producer. And often those primary producers are, they've no one to push those costs onto. And those costs are non-zero. And ultimately, the consumer, every time I've talked to people like Ornua about whether they can get a return for the food they're producing that is of higher credentials, they say that their customers, and ultimately the customers of those customers, aren't willing to pay for it. So we have a problem in Europe, more generally in Western society, with saying we want lots of good stuff associated with food, but we're not yet willing to pay more for it. And I think that's really why we have the Common Agricultural Policy and why we support farmer incomes, because we want them to engage in more costly methods of production, but we're not willing to pay for it through the marketplace, so it has to be paid for somehow.
Someone has to pay for it.
And that's ultimately taxpayers. So we are either happy with that and we actually properly engage with it and accept that and stop giving out about it, or we actually start to pay for it when we go shopping.
Now, down the route, we're taking questions on Slido as well. So if you have a question for anyone on our panel, or indeed Patricia, same link as earlier, do please send your questions in, and we'll close out with them in just a minute. Maria, we heard Patricia reference the EU Agri-Food Chain Observatory, which is going to get these insights into the agri-food sector. How important is it to support the work of the regulator here?
Okay, so can I just take you back 1 second? Don't forget, when you go into a shop and you're looking at the price of your product, don't forget 90% of our beef, sheep and dairy goes overseas. So sometimes people forget that and they just look at the domestic market. We are shipping stuff all to the four corners of the globe, and that's important. In terms of AFCO, so I would say you have to see this as it's evolution of a journey. We have had market transparency regulations for some time. We report a lot of information on market transparency into the EU, as do all other member states. Originally, this was mainly at the point of between the primary producer and the processor. So we were giving information on what processors were paying the primary producer. And I would say the department publish, and also Board BIA, a lot of that data. It then developed, and what the developed market transparency regulations back in 2009 did, they then looked at another point along the chain, which is a point between the processors and the supplier and the retailers, So that was the start of tracking everything along the supply chain. AFCO at the moment is looking at that existing data and then the contributions of the members of the observatory. So they're looking at the data that we as a department already collect of the stakeholders and input there. I think in terms of AFCO identifying what more data is required and how else they can fill these gaps along the supply chain, I think that will be very positive for the regulator, because what it will mean is there will be more data automatically out there. Two things: there'll be more data published at EU level, but also businesses will be submitting more data to us. And if I can just give you a very quick example of this. For example, under the more recent regulation, we had to submit data on forequarters and hindquarters. I won't get too technical. We don't sell...
Please don't. I'm terrified already.
We don't sell meat like that, so it was really important that we would still be able to contribute something that made sense on a European level. So we sat down with the meat industry and we said, how can we disaggregate a hindquarter and a forequarter into the various cuts, put it back together, reconstitute it, so we can send data to the EU that is useful and can be tracked across all the member states. So we were able to do that, and then subsequently, because the industry already had that data, they agreed with the agri-food regulator on a voluntary basis to submit that. So what I'm saying there is there'll be more data published, businesses will be collating more data, and they will then be more likely to be willing to share that data because there isn't an extra administrative burden on them.
Patricia, before I go to questions from the floor, I mean, it's a very relevant point, and the one thing I'm taking from this, it's not just this conference, but we have a sea of data, and we're only starting to wade through it. We had our first survey this morning that's going to help guide policy and give us an insight here. Now it's happening at European level. It's how we interpret that data, but it will also support Ireland because we're no longer looking at ourselves in isolation. I mean, it's really important we get to grips with that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would see the European level observatory as it's a tool for the Irish regulator, and sometimes we can drown in data, but it's so important to base our policies and our methodologies and our indicators on solid data, and Maria points to a very important, it's a tedious thing, which is comparability of data, and settling down the operations of the observatory will take a little bit of time in that sense, because apples and oranges, of course, don't always compare that well, and there are others on the panel who know that far better than I do. But I would see this as a major positive and a tool, for the Irish regulator to use, and indeed for businesses to access information. Yeah.
Okay, everybody benefits from knowing what that data says. Okay, we'll take some questions from the floor on Slido if we can. Magically, they should appear on a screen here in front of me any moment now, and if they don't, I'll have to make them up, and that'll be more of a chat. Thank God for that. With the consolidation in many sectors, how does the panel suggest long-term contracts can be implemented for Irish farmers? Karen, that's come up a lot. Contracts, they want certainty. Can we actually give them certainty in any way?
This is one of these questions, I suppose, where we ask what's the appropriate mechanism for doing this? Because when we talk about regulation more broadly, we talk about influencing market conduct, but law is not the inevitable mechanism or necessarily the most effective mechanism for that.
Well, law can cost you a lot of money.
Well, it's one of those things we've heard this morning about collaborative efforts. We've talked about different types of engagement. Niamh was talking about the charter. So we have to think about this in terms of how to go about doing it. And that is potentially a problematic consideration in law from that point of view. So the question really is there a way of encouraging longer term contracts that offers a benefit for both parties involved, and particularly from the point of view of the buyers, rather than mandating it legally, which somebody mentioned as well, unintended consequences.
Well, yeah,
that's always the issue.
That could end up as an interference in the market with terrible consequences. What are the possible strategy examples you can think of to incentivize taxpayers and producers alike to want to pay extra for fairness in the food chain?
Well, just to add to Karen's point, I think there are examples from the Irish food industry of in the dairy industry, for example, of businesses offering farmers long-term contracts that go beyond spot kind of delivery, get the price that's there in the marketplace. And that's good in terms of the certainty desire that farmers want to have, but depending on how markets develop, what looked like a good idea can seem like a bad idea.
Well,
The butter price goes through the roof.
And to borrow something from another sector, sometimes they hedge aviation fuel and end up everyone's fares go up the following year because there was a change in the petrol price. But anyway, that's a good example.
I think there's a role for businesses to think about how they can do that to make their supply chain more sustainable, and that's what the dairy industry did. I mean, it can be probably more challenging in the meat industry to do that because, in other countries you have vertical contracts in terms of meat production, and that often can lead to other problems in terms of power between big meat processors and smaller scale farmers that aren't often it's not as rosy a garden as it might appear from the outside.
Just to say, as Patricia said earlier, we're looking at that under the CMO, the changes to the CMO regulation are looking at the introduction of contracts. But we've had a lot of stakeholder engagement, as we do anytime there's a policy change on this, because you have to ensure that it's not too blunt an instrument. So in Ireland's context, we're looking at, well, we already have the co-ops. We don't want something introduced that will make the situation less favourable for farmers when you have a cooperative structure. You also look on the meat side, a lot of livestock is sold through marts, and there's a economic and social value to having marts in your society. So we need to make sure that we don't introduce something that in fact is not as good as what we already have.
Just on that idea of paying more for sustainable practices, I mean, I'm conscious that we've talked a lot from the farmer to the supplier to the retailer. A lot of awareness has to be done on the part of the consumer as well, isn't it? Is the consumer a key part of this process, do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, it is. And back to a point that Maria made a few minutes ago, we've got to think about our consumer as not us, but people out there beyond this island, because they're our consumers. I mean, we could all pay more in Ireland for what we produce in Ireland, and it wouldn't change the bottom line for Irish farmers incredibly, because most Irish farmers are producing meat and milk and grain, or meat and milk in particular, that's eaten by somebody who's not Irish. And it's about how can we persuade that average European consumer to value what we're producing a bit more. And that goes back to smart green growth, the idea that we have to build brand awareness for Ireland as a food island, as a producer of goods that consumers should be willing to pay more for some of the time. And that's a hard thing to do. I mean, it's a really hard thing to do.
That's the nature of it being a joint enterprise as opposed to individuals trying to get the best out of it. One last question. Farmer subsidies have never been index linked, so how can they compensate for the lack of return from the marketplace? That's a Kevin question if ever there was one.
Yeah, I mean,
I hope so.
I mean,
Maria, don't worry about it. I have it covered.
In the European Economic Community, we used to index farm support prices, and that did not lead to good outcomes from anybody's perspective. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think the challenge will be, and this is what Ireland's going to be grappling with when it has the presidency of the European Union, is how do we maintain the budget that's necessary to support the European agriculture system. And that won't be an easy discussion because there's lots of other demands for our tax euros. So I don't see subsidies being index linked. Hopefully the ECB succeeds in its mandate of keeping inflation low so that we won't have a 22 and 23 again for another 20 or 30 years, where we have that big inflationary shock that hits consumers and hits producers in terms of the elevated cost of production. And I'd be confident that that might be achievable.
I'd still take from this panel the positivity that we're moving in the right direction. We just have to help try and everyone move in the same direction.
And just to say, there is flexibility built into it to deal with exceptional circumstances where you have a massive price crash, or in the case of the pig sector where we had really high inputs with poor prices, and there is provision within the EU for exceptional aid.
Of all the departments that I've dealt with over the years, the ones that have to deal with the worst and weirdest crises is the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and you're good at it, which is good to know. Ladies and gentlemen, huge round of applause for our panel of Patricia Riley, Maria Dunn, Kevin Hanrahan and Karen Lynch-Shalley. We leave it go that way. Gora Mila Mahagav Galera, thank you so much, everybody. Again, really good insight there into what's happening on a European level, but it's all about transparency, it's all about openness, and it's all about the sectors working together and pushing in the same direction for everybody's benefit. And that's what the regulator is designed to do, and that's hopefully the journey that we are on today.